So today's event is part of our series 30 post-Soviet years that revisits the watershed year of 1991 and investigates the legacies of the Soviet era. And tonight we will focus on the legacies of the highly integrated Soviet economic space. Soviet era integration was really very tight, especially given the lack of freedom to trade outside the Union, the USSR. Industrial activity was widely dispersed, specialized regionally, and highly integrated by the Soviet central planners. And during our panel discussion, we will discuss how the process of economic disintegration gathered pace, especially after 1991, in what ways disrupted economic links have been restored, and how the level of economic entanglement varies across countries in the post-Soviet region. And we will then turn to the question how Eurasian regionalism through organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union, but also through the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation has been a motor of integration, and whether China's Belt and Road Initiative presents a chance or a challenge for increasing economic integration among the former Soviet republics. And I'm delighted to discuss these questions with two distinguished experts tonight. Alexander Lippmann is a professor of Russian and East European politics at Freie Universität in Berlin, Free University Berlin. And one of his research interests concerns cross-border cooperation of authoritarian states. He's especially focusing on authoritarian regionalism in Eurasia, and he has therefore published widely on Eurasian regional integration, with a special emphasis on the Eurasian Economic Union and Russian power politics. And one of his ongoing research projects also investigates the extent to which the Eurasian regional organizations are able to develop their own actorness, or rather serve as a tool of foreign policy of the dominant member states. So Alexander, I'm really happy that you are able to join us tonight. Welcome. And my second guest is Johannes Lin, who is a non-resident fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution and a consultant for the Asian Development Bank. And to be honest, it was really difficult to kind of prepare this short bio because you occupied so many interesting positions in your career. So let me just highlight a few of your former positions that maybe I think are most relevant for our today's discussion. So Johannes occupied a number of high-level positions at the World Bank, including the position of the bank's vice president for Europe and Central Asia between 1996 and 2003, so very exciting times. And later, he was a director of the Wolfenson Center for Development and Brookings, and his current research interests are in the area of development effectiveness, regional cooperation with a special focus on Central Asia, especially CAREC, and global governance reform. And he's also a consultant for the Asian Development Bank, as I've mentioned before. Before we start our first round of questions, let me say a few words about housekeeping here for this event. So first of all, I would kindly ask the audience to type your questions in the chat, and please do not wait until the very end, but just type the questions as we are talking, and I will try to make sure that we address them as soon as possible, that we pick up on them. And if you rather have a comment on what has been said, feel also free to type in your comment, maybe a little bit, not too long, obviously, rather brief comments, please. But this is also very welcome. And please note that the event will be recorded, and that the stream will be published on our website later on. However, I will not announce your name or your institution when I read out your question or comment. So we treat the audience anonymously here. Okay, so now without further ado, let me ask the first question, and this question goes to Johannes. So could you please explain to us how the process of economic disintegration has gathered pace after the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Thank you, Julia, and good evening to all the participants tonight. I'm delighted that I can join you all in Berlin. I'm actually based in the Washington area, east coast of the US, but I have ties to Berlin, including 1 year at Freie Universität. That was 1964 to 64 to 65. So it's a few years ago. You can date me, I guess, on this one. But anyway, thanks very much. It's really great to be here today. And also, actually, it's a great opportunity to meet Alexander, because Alexander is my hero when it comes to expert work on the topic we're discussing, but more generally, Eurasian integration, because from my perspective, that's actually one of the defining features of our current century, that integration process. So understanding it is very important. And Alexander and his colleague, Yevgeny Vinokurov, are, from my perspective, the best to share experience and wisdom on this topic with us. So, but let's get into the question of Julius. And let me start by just recalling for all of us that, of course, there was a dramatic economic recession in the former Soviet Union after the breakup of the Soviet Union. GDP dropped almost 45% in the newly independent republics of the former Soviet Union. Really a dramatic decline, which one hardly imagine, and pretty much is only comparable with the big depression back in the 20s of the 1920s in the world. Now, at the time, there was a big debate among the experts, Western experts in particular, about the speed and depth of reform in the transition process from plan to market. And some blamed, for example, Joe Stiglitz, the famous Nobel Prize winner, blamed shock therapy for the economic collapse, while others argued that reforms weren't fast and deep enough. Now, to my mind, as I looked at this after about 8 years of working in the region in 2004, I felt we collectively hadn't paid enough attention to the economic impact of disintegration as a major cause of the economic decline, which in a way is weird because as economists, we always advise integrate, open up, and so on, and that generates economic benefits. Well, if you have disintegration, it's only to be expected that there would be economic problems resulting from this and economic losses. So I looked at this in some detail in a paper in 2004 as a missing piece of the puzzles to understand what happened in this process of dramatic economic decline, and actually concluded that this particular aspect, the disintegration process, was a major factor explaining the significant recession that happened. And it's very interesting. I didn't have great econometric skills or data in my hand. It was mostly qualitative and looking at comparative information across a few countries. But recently, very sophisticated econometric research project by Jo Reinartz and Jakob von Schoenbeck actually demonstrated precisely my point, looking at the secessions across a large range of countries and history, but specifically also focusing on the former Soviet Union and concluding that territorial disintegration was a major factor explaining the deep recession in the former Soviet Union. Now, very quickly, what were some of the major factors that actually turned disintegration into economic disaster? Well, 7 factors in my assessment. First of all, new borders. And actually in some countries also internal barriers, at least temporarily. New borders interrupted trade and transport significantly. So the borders, simply the fact that you had borders put a stop to a lot of traditional interaction. But in addition, you had a collapse of the Interenterprise payment system and barter system across the various enterprises spread across this huge economic space. And mostly also, very importantly, that collapse of that payment system, especially across borders, was very disruptive to trade and economic activity cross borders, with inter-enterprise debt now having to be settled in foreign currency, mostly dollars, which was in very scarce supply, and therefore firms simply couldn't pay other firms in other republics. A third factor is that the integrated transport system collapsed, especially rail and air, especially air. Actually, for many years, as you traveled through Central Asia and other republics, you could see a whole host of stranded airplanes at the local airports, which never made it back to Moscow or just were left to rot. Just an incredible shock in terms of the transport infrastructure. Now, as a result of these three factors, new borders, inter-enterprise payment collapse, and collapse of the transport system, the trade collapsed. And in the CIS, so-called CIS, that's the former Soviet Union minus the Baltic countries, trade collapsed by about 80%, 1991 to 1993, dramatic. Now, this was made worse by the highly integrated and specialized supply, what today we would call supply chains, spread across the Soviet Union, and that made matters considerably worse. Let me give you three brief examples. So there was a Kyrgyz company that produced hay balers. Ich glaube, auf Deutsch sind das Heuballenpressen. I don't know whether that's the right term, but anyway, Heuballenpressen. There was only one firm in the whole former Soviet Union for hay balers, and that was in Kyrgyzstan. Now, that firm very quickly collapsed simply because it couldn't pay US dollars for Estonian compressors and couldn't find adequate replacements elsewhere. So that firm collapsed. And as a result, for a while, there were basically no more hay balers being produced in the former Soviet Union. Then there was a farm in Russia that couldn't import feed, for chicken feed from Ukraine, and had to cut its chicken stock, poultry stock, from 250,000 to 250,000 over a 1 year period. I mean, dramatic. And finally, this is sort of my favorite example, actually, dramatic example, is the Kyrgyz sheep. So Kyrgyzstan had about 13 million sheep in 1990 and exported a large amount of wool as a result of this stock of sheep. By 2002, 13 million sheep had been reduced to 3 million, simply due to lack of markets, lack of supplies, and so on. So the impact was dramatic and pervasive across the whole space. Now, then there were four other factors, which I want to mention very briefly, because they were also important in certain regards. Central, regional power and water systems disintegrated, and that was especially relevant for Central Asia. And if you travel even today through Central Asia, the countryside, you still see abandoned irrigation infrastructure all over the place. It's just amazing. Then you had central budget transfers and price subsidies were eliminated, largely eliminated. That raised the cost of living, it hit low budgets, and therefore education, health, and pensions, and it prevented, very importantly, the necessary operations maintenance expenditures for transport and utility systems. You also, of course, had the lack of, after the breakup, the lack of the central government's administrative apparatus that had been working from Moscow. And each new republic had to now develop its own administration. And lastly, you had return migration of 3 million Russians, mostly skilled, which left huge gaps in labor markets in some of the republics, including and especially Kazakhstan. What is perhaps surprising, I think is really important to also mention that, however, is that it was a remarkably peaceful transition and breakup, considering other historical examples of breakups. There were some exceptions. Tajikistan had a civil war, and Azerbaijan and Armenia, of course, also have had lasting conflict. So, but overall, it was remarkably peaceful. So what about then the overall economic impact? And Julia, I hope I'm not going on too long. I'm coming to closure here. So the overall economic impact is interesting. Let's distinguish between Central Europe, Southeast Europe, and the Baltics on the one hand, and the CIS, the Soviet Union minus the Baltics on the other hand. So for Central Europe, Southeast Europe, and the Baltics, the impact was severe, but relatively limited. You saw a 3-year decline, a loss of about 15% of GDP for the region, but after 6 years, and after 6 years, the 1990 level of GDP had been recovered. Now, the reason for what turns out, if you compare it with this, the former Soviet Union, or CIS in particular, is that actually that this was less severe than in the latter group, is that Central Europe, Southeast Europe, and the Baltics were less integrated with Comecon and had greater access to Western markets and external financial support after the breakup. In contrast, the CIS had a dramatic 7-year decline, loss of almost 45% of GDP and more for some countries like Armenia, 65% loss, Georgia, 70% loss. And for the region as a whole, the CIS as a whole, the 1990 level of GDP is estimated to have been recovered only by 2004, so about 14 years later. So the recovery was much slower in the CIS because of the fact that the disruption was much larger because of the highly integrated Comecon supply chains that I mentioned earlier, and reintegration with each other and the world markets was very slow. Now, as a result, of course, you had in these long periods, the 15 years of dramatic shortfalls in economic activity, huge jumps in unemployment, poverty, and social dislocation. Now, I just want to mention a brief lesson for today, and that is just to stress that economic disintegration and integration of supply chains are important factors in economic performance. Whether these disruptions and disintegration are due to Brexit, due to new protectionism, due to COVID, due to sanctions, or even just a freighter getting stuck in the Suez Canal, the impacts can be severe, and we, I think, witness it every day, I assume also to some extent in Germany, but certainly here in the United States, when supply chains break, and they broke dramatically in the former Soviet Union in particular, the economic impacts are severe. So protecting supply chains is a major objective, and it needs to be a major objective today. And indeed, further, if anything, further integration can only be helpful rather than hindrance. Thanks, Julia.
Great, thank you so much, Johannes, for this overview. I think it was really, really comprehensive, but also concise, and it was really a great start for our discussion today. So you've already mentioned, the various aspects where we kind of witnessed the disruption when it comes to trade, when it comes to transport, but also when it comes to the labor market, inter-enterprise links, and so on and so forth. And you also referred to the variation when it comes to how these countries actually recovered. And this brings me to the next question, Alexander, that goes to you, because what I would like to know from you is how have these disrupted economic links between the Soviet republics actually been restored in the post-Soviet era? And how does the level of economic entanglement also vary across the country? I mean, Johannes already spoke, but some variation when it comes to the costs of the disruption and the economic disintegration. But I would now like to know how those countries actually coped with it, and how they reintegrated, and what kind of variation we observe today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julia, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And I have to return the favor. It's a great honor for me to be able to finally meet Johannes, at least via Zoom, because I was also reading your work for the last 10 years, and it greatly inspired me. Johannes, for example, published one of the first, at least the first for me, papers on integration in Greater Eurasia, between Europe, Asia, and the narrow Eurasia, the post-Soviet space. Long before everybody started talking about this, Johannes was talking about this. So that's really a great pleasure for me to be here. And the question you asked now is absolutely non-trivial one. The point is, during this enormous economic collapse of the 1990s, the consensus which existed at that moment in time, at least among many observers, was that, well, indeed, now disruptions are very, very costly. But at the same time, this is also a necessary evil, curing the artificial, inefficient linkages created by the planned economy of the Soviet era. So the examples Johannes showed to us, that is one single company producing equipment for the whole country, which is then going bankrupt. The arguments which were presented then were, well, it's necessary for this company to go bankrupt, because that's the only way for us to finally resolve the artificial, unnatural economic ties which were created by the communist regime, and to translate them into what will be natural economic ties driven by interests of the market actors. And the interests of market actors will drive post-Soviet countries away from each other. So they will open the global economy, they will enter the open global economy, they will develop economic ties to other countries, and then post-Soviet space, Eurasian space as an economic entity will disappear. And interestingly enough, these expectations were, while partly true, only partly true. The extent to which former Soviet republics still remain connected to each other, and the extent to which new economic ties within this space were created were greatly underestimated during the period of collapse. So what happened? Post-Soviet countries shared common industrial linkages from the Soviet era, but they also shared something more important. They shared common culture. They shared common economic culture. Business in many of these countries happened according to common informal rules, which people from other countries of the former Soviet Union knew, while the outsiders didn't. The people in these countries spoke Russian, and Russian as a lingua franca remained very important, at least for the substantial period of time after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were diaspora networks present in other countries. So this whole cultural ties, also legal ties, the law of these countries looked similar to each other because they all shared the common Soviet past, became a very attractive, a very natural ground for restoring economic ties. And now restoring economic ties based not on the old planned economy, but based on economic interests of private actors. And over time, private actors at different levels, from large corporations to informal networks to migrant communities, created a new unity in the region, which at some point of time was also strengthened by the state. States in some of these countries, especially Russia, becoming more active economic players and also projecting their power through economic ties, using economic ties to extend their political sphere of influence. So to illustrate to you just two examples of this extended new economic ties, I prepared two PowerPoint slides, which I would like to share with you. And these are really very recent data. So they became available in the last month or in the last week in one case. And I'm not going to talk about trade. Because trade is actually an example of the ties which, while to some extent were revived, still remains way below the Soviet era. And when new actors like China, for example, became highly prominent, especially for Central Asia, I guess we'll talk more about that later. But I'll talk about two other types of ties where exactly Eurasian countries became important for each other: migration and investments. Migration. The common labor market in Eurasia emerged with labor migrants from Central Asia, from the Caucasus republics, moving to more prosperous Russia, Kazakhstan, and turning their remittances into a major source of economic development for some of them. And here's just one graph to show you the importance of this parameter. What you see here is the statistics of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs about the number of new labor contracts with foreign citizens signed in Russia in January to September 2021. Mind you, 2021, COVID, borders are closed. During this period, more than 400,000 citizens of Uzbekistan got their job in Russia. More than 250,000 people from Kyrgyzstan. More than 150,000, almost 200,000 from Tajikistan. And then go Armenia, Kazakhstan, even Ukraine, in spite of all political difficulties, seems to supply labor migrants to Russia to a much larger extent than the rest of the world. And this is in a closed world where borders are closed and where travel becomes increasingly difficult. The second picture, and I'm sorry for it being in Russian, that's because the source was published literally a week ago and the English translation is forthcoming, is from a research project of the Eurasian Development Bank, collecting data on the FDI in the Eurasian Economic Union and the CIS. And this is the most recent data set they have published. And what you see here is the information on the investments made by different Eurasian countries in other Eurasian countries. So the dark blue is Russia, then we have light blue Kazakhstan, and green is Azerbaijan, yellow is Belarus, orange is Ukraine, and so on. And what you see here, there was a constant increase of these investments until 2012. Then there was a period of decline until 2015, also triggered by Russian economic problems, by the war in Ukraine. But since 2015, investments and also Russian investments in Eurasia are again going up. And while we are not at the level at the peak in 2012, they didn't seem to disappear over time. So long story short, my time is running out. So let me finish it with one simple conclusion. Eurasian economic ties are much more robust than people believed them to be 30 years ago. And more importantly, Eurasian economic ties turned from planned economy ties into new novel market ties, connecting countries in configurations, in architectures, which were not expected at the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this new market reality is something one needs to deal with while talking about Eurasia. So thank you.
Alexander, thank you so much. I have a follow-up question here, just to get this right, maybe also for the audience. I mean, you have been saying that Eurasian economic integration is at a higher level that we might expect. At the same time, you also mentioned that there's a great variation when it comes in migration and investments. You showed the slides. Are better reintegrated than trade. And just to get this right, what is the? I mean, how would you explain this? Is this because of the because the root causes for trade disintegration were so huge? I mean, Johannes described it, right? When it comes to transport networks that got disrupted, Interenterprise links, and so on and so forth. Is this the reason? Because you could also argue, the Russian Gost standard is still, applied, across the post-Soviet space to a large extent. Obviously, not in all countries, especially not in those that kind of, try to get closer to the EU, countries like Ukraine, for example. But how would you explain this, just to get this right? Also?
Yeah, I think this enormous cost of economic collapse obviously played an important role, and they played an important role, especially if the production ties turned out to be irreplaceable. For example, in case of resources had to be or supplied from other countries. But I don't think that's the complete story of the Eurasian reintegration. Another part of Eurasian reintegration is very much the movement of people and of private companies exploiting commonalities in culture, in laws, and the existing ties. And these movements would occur even without this external collapse. They're simply natural because people are looking for an environment in which it is convenient for them to conduct their business and to live. So to give you one example, I talked about migration. And for migration, it's clear it's not collapse as such. Well, collapse played a role by creating a push factor, at least for Central Asian countries, but it's also the cultural commonality and the still open borders, at least during the pre-COVID era. But let me give you another example, Russian retail. For Russian retail, Eurasian countries are extremely important. And that has nothing to do with the economic collapse in the USSR. Russian retail is an entirely new phenomenon. What is driving integration, what is driving the economic expansion is simply the fact that you can take business practices in organization of a large retail store you have in Moscow and transfer it to Kiev or to Almaty. And people will get used to it and they will buy goods in a way similar to that they are doing in Moscow. And it's easier to go to Almaty or to Kiev prior to the conflict than to go even to Warsaw and certainly to Berlin and to Paris or to Washington. So that's exactly what Russian business does.
Yes. Johannes, you have
I think Alexander is absolutely right. This migration story is very, very important, understanding what's been happening, especially for Central Asia, but also Ukraine, Georgia, and so on. So the one important aspect about that, and that is kind of a policy aspect, important to remember, is that the fact that that Russia maintained, in essence, an open border for migration. You didn't need special visas. You had to get a propiska when you got there, I guess. But it was relatively easy. And actually, I admire Russia greatly for being so open to the immigration. when it isn't always easy. I mean, yeah, there are cultural similarities, but I remember being in St. Petersburg, and frankly, you know, if you go to the local market there, it's very culturally very different from the rest of St. Petersburg, because it's all Central Asians. And when I talked to my Russian friends, they weren't always very happy about the way, but Russia as a whole managed to keep its policy environment such that that disintegration process actually wasn't as severe as it could have been if it had actually put a stop to the migration. So to me, this is a very important part of the story. I'm glad you mentioned it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for jumping in here. Let us actually, the question in the chat that just popped up concerning Eurasian reintegration when it comes to, you know, bigger regional integration projects fits perfectly to our, planned schedule, because the next question I would like to ask is to what extent the Eurasian Economic Union, but also CAREC or the Belt and Road Initiative actually served as a motor of integration in the post-Soviet era. And then, of course, the question that was also asked in the chat, to what extent is the Eurasian Economic Project more a political project, mostly inspired by Russia, than an economic project that is driven by, the motivation to really reintegrate the space economically? Then, of course, we will also touch upon that. But Alexander, since you are the specialist here for the Eurasian Economic Union, I would like you to start with the question, focus on the Eurasian Economic Union, and then we will hand over to Johannes to take a closer look at the cooperation initiatives that have been going on in the context of Central Asia, CAREC specifically. Alexander, the floor is yours again.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, we need to distinguish between the spontaneous bottom-up economic ties and a top-down project like the Eurasian Economic Union.
Yeah.
What we're talking about so far was spontaneous bottom-up economic ties, and they're obviously not driven by a political project. I mean, migrants from Uzbekistan go to Russia not because they like Putin or dislike Putin, but because they have job opportunities in Russia. So this is market forces pure, if you want. Eurasian Economic Union is different. Eurasian Economic Union, from the very beginning, a very formalized institutional architecture, in many instances trying to resemble the European Union, obviously not going to the level of integration of European Union, but at least mimicking some of the institutions, the wording, the language, the fundamental approach European Union took to regionalism. And the configuration of countries participating in the Eurasian Economic Union was not necessarily that of countries particularly strongly involved in these Eurasian economic exchanges. For example, Tajikistan, which is an important source of labor migrants to Russia, is not part of the Union. Armenia was in a very special situation because of economic isolation, war with Azerbaijan. It was also not a necessary or a logical extension of the Eurasian Economic Union. It doesn't have a common border to other Eurasian Economic Union countries. And this is very unusual if you think about regional economic organizations. Nevertheless, Eurasian Economic Union was created with a very ambitious goal of widespread economic integration. This has to be highlighted because Kazakhstan insisted on purging even the smallest element of political integration from the design of the EIU. And in a nutshell, you can look at this as a glass half full or glass half empty. Glass half full. Eurasian Economic Union is a functioning customs union, with a lot of exceptions, especially after Kazakhstan joined the WTO, but still there are very few functioning customs unions in the world. It is slowly working on the non-tariff barriers. Again, there is a long road ahead, but there is, for example, harmonization of standards ongoing, and not necessarily based on old costs, sometimes based on the actually new standards which Eurasian Economic Union imports from Europe. It did create a common migration space. And here it is actually comparable, indeed comparable to the European Economic Union in terms of freedom of migration. And it did create a common space for the movement of capital. So this is the glass half full. Glass half empty. Eurasian Economic Union, when the treaty was signed and the organization launched in 2015, created a set of the so-called functional markets where the integration ought to be developed in the years to come until 2025. And these functional markets were particularly sensitive markets like medical products or electricity or oil and gas or financial markets, where countries originally were not ready to engage in the wide-scale integration initiatives, but where they hoped to create some common framework and open them up to each other in the years to come. And now we can already talk about almost 5-6 years of this functional markets integration, and the balance is unfortunately not as good as one would expect. Many of these projects are de jure implemented. There is a common electricity market, a common market for medical products, but the implementation of these markets is achieved at the cost of any substance. So a lot of concessions had to be made, and a lot of authorities actually remained with the national governments. Another thing which we can now speak about as a fact in the Eurasian Economic Union is that individual countries did not stop playing political games and blocking cross-border exchange from time to time if it's politically suits them. Russia played this game with Belarus, but even Kazakhstan, the white knight of Eurasian regionalism, at some point of time closed the border to Kyrgyzstan because president of Kyrgyzstan said some unpleasant things about Nazarbayev. I mean, really unpleasant, but the border was closed. So this is also a reality of the Eurasian Economic Union. And not to take too much of your time, maybe to finish it with one final sentence, your question, Julia, was also whether Eurasian Economic Union supports the development of this bottom-up economic ties, whether there is real benefit in terms of trade, migration, investment flows from the Eurasian Economic Union. And the unfortunate reality is it's very difficult to answer this question. And this benefit, if it is there, is unlikely to be massive. This, however, is not related to the Eurasian Economic Union as such. It is related to the fact that the Union was created at an extremely unfavorable point of time. It was created at the moment when Russian economy entered stagnation. It was created in the immediate aftermath of the conflict in Crimea. Western sanctions were imposed. And throughout the whole period of existence of the Eurasian Economic Union, Eurasian countries faced a relatively difficult period of their development. And now it continues with COVID. So under these conditions, even the best possible union would not produce very strong economic effects. And the Eurasian Economic Union was not the best of the best, so to say.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Before we turn to the question to Russian power politics and to what extent the Eurasian Economic Union serves political goals, not only for Russia, but also for other countries, as you pointed out, like Kazakhstan. I would like to kind of give the floor now to Johannes to talk a little bit more about forums like CAREC, because I don't think that these are very well known in Germany, but also beyond, not as much as the Eurasian Economic Union. I think we rarely talk about them. And I would like you, Johannes, to give us your insights on what role does CAREC play, what was the motivation for its emergence, and how does it also link to regional organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union.
Sure, thanks very much. And so first let me say a few words about what CAREC is and what it isn't. So CAREC stands for Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Forum, which already indicates that it's not a formal regional organization like the Eurasian Economic Union, but it's a forum. It's where 11 members now, it started with 5, I believe, it's now 11 members, including the 5 Central Asia former Soviet Union republics, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Mongolia, Pakistan, and the People's Republic of China, where they get together usually once a year at ministerial level. They're supported by senior officials meetings and by sector working groups. They're also very importantly supported by 6 international organizations, the Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IMF, the Islamic Development Bank, and UNDP and the World Bank, with the Asian Development running a secretariat. So it's kind of you can call it a partnership, relatively loosely organized and strongly, and that's really important, strongly supported by traditionally 6 international organizations. It is kind of an umbrella organization to help, is one way to interpret, to help the international organizations to support regional cooperation and integration in these countries, initially focused on Central Asia, but recently expanded to the 11 countries that I mentioned. It's also important to note that China is indeed an important participant and one might even say driver of this effort. Russia is not part of it. I actually at one point when I was involved as an advisor to CAREC suggested that Russia be invited to join, but that didn't go anywhere far because Russia is not a member of the Asian Development Bank. And with the Asian Development Bank being in the driver's seat, so to speak, here as a secretariat, this would have caused all sorts of issues. There was also, I think, some resistance in Moscow at the time. So it's an interesting factor that this is, it is an important forum with China present. And of course, China being as large as it is an important driver, but it's not the exclusive driver of this initiative. Now, it's been traditionally focused on trade, transport, trade and trade facilitation, very importantly, trying to reduce the barriers at the borders, both within Central Asia, but also in the region, but also with neighboring countries. And it focused on energy. Recently, the focus has been expanded to include water, agriculture, tourism, and health. There's also something I want to mention, which may be of interest to you, Julia, and your colleagues. There's the CAREC Institute, which you may not have heard about. It's a think tank that's now been working about 6 years, specifically focused on regional integration and connectivity issues. It's funded mostly by China and the Asian Development Bank. It's based somewhat, unfortunately, I think, in Urumqi in Western China. It has had a slow start, but it's now much improved actually over the last year or two in its work. And I strongly recommend, if you're interested in regional cooperation in that region, to consult its website because it's got lots of very interesting stuff on there. Now, you asked what are some of the achievements and some of the limitations of CAREC. I think the achievement includes, first of all, that it's kept the focus on regional connectivity, the national and the regional policy dialogue. It definitely developed CAREC transport corridors as a concept, but also then supported by significant investments. And it worked on reestablishing the Central Asia regional electricity grid, which disintegrated over a number of years after the Soviet collapse. It's also been an umbrella for major investments of regional infrastructures, especially 40 billion over 20 years, 3/4 of that in transport, mostly funded by the multinational banks and financial partners. But it's also been focused on research, capacity building, and policy support. One aspect that I want to mention is particularly important, especially for the research community, but also I think a lesson for other regional cooperation efforts. And this is that CAREC introduced fairly early on, I think about 15 years ago, a systematic measurement of progress in terms of time of transit and cost of transit along the 6 major CAREC corridors, transport corridors. This is unique because mostly with all the investments and all the policy efforts, people actually generally in these regional cooperation fora and organizations have very little idea how much actual progress there is in terms of improved connectivity. Now, the evidence actually is not that great. It turns out when you measure the results in terms of time and costs, they have not improved much, at least not over the last 10 years. So clearly, more needs to be done, and this is where I want to end as far as CAREC is concerned. Much more needs to be done. Central Asia, the 5 Central Asian countries, and even Azerbaijan, and not surprisingly, Afghanistan and so on, are among the least integrated regions in the world, similar, as one study pointed out, to the level of integration of Central Africa. The CAREC Institute Central Asia Integration Index also shows that there's been limited progress with connectivity, except for infrastructure. Kazakhstan and Georgia are doing best. Turkmenistan, not surprisingly, is doing worst, but overall, there hasn't been all that much progress despite all this effort. And so clearly more is needed. Now, there are some positive trends that one can point to. First of all, Uzbekistan's opening up and reforms in the last 3 to 4 years are a critical factor given Uzbekistan's importance and its central location in the region. And also in August 2021, you had a meeting of the 5 Central Asian presidents, which actually focused on connectivity. And given the nature of the politics in these countries, you know, you need the presidential support for things to happen. And so one is actually can be somewhat optimistic that in the years to come, there'll be further progress in reintegration as far as these elements that Karek is involved in are concerned. Now, you also at some point asked or briefly mentioned BRI. I can get into that, but let me maybe stop here, Julia.
Yes, thank you so much, Johannes. Yes, I also have a question about the Belt and Road, but I thought we first focus on the Eurasian Economic Union and Karek, and then move on to the Belt and Road. And just let me pick up on two issues here, because what I would like to tease out a little bit more is to the role of Russia and China, and then once we talk about China, then of course the BRI kicks in too. But let us focus first on Russia, because this is interesting that you said that they were actually invited to join Karek, but then they were actually reluctant or not really interested in joining this initiative. And on the other hand, also the ADB and others, maybe on the Karek side, are not really kind of fond of this idea. But when we talk about the Eurasian Economic Union, Alexander, I know that what you've also been arguing in the past is actually that this project also lost its significance for Russia in recent years, and it doesn't play the role it used to play right now in order to help Russia to restore some kind of regional or even great power status. Obviously not a great power status because it's focused on Eurasia, but at least the regional power status. So could you maybe elaborate on this aspect a little bit more and explain to us why this happened? Why the kind of declining significance of the Eurasian Economic Union for Russia?
Right. I think to answer this question, we again need to distinguish two different. So we first distinguish between the formal institutional integration in the Eurasian Economic Union and the spontaneous economic ties. And now we need to make another more subtle distinction between the actual Eurasian Economic Union, the organization which really exists and operates, and the image of the Eurasian Economic Union existing in the minds of Russian leaderships and Russian experts. Because if you look at the discussion on the Eurasian Economic Union, on Eurasian regionalism, which was ongoing in Russia for the last decade, it almost looks like that many of the experts and many of the politicians were talking about something entirely different than the real Eurasian Economic Union. They were not so much focused on creating an organization imitating the European Union or promoting common rules, common norms. In Russia, Eurasian Economic Union was really perceived as a necessary attribute of Russia being a great power. So typical narrative you find in Russian sources goes like this: all great powers have their own integration units. There was NAFTA for the US, there is Mercosur for Brazil and Argentina. You can name the country yourself for the European Union. Russian experts actually doing that. And we also need one. And for us, it was going to be the Eurasian Economic Union. So for many people in the Russian elites, the reason for entering the organization was actually the geopolitical projection of power. Now, that does not mean that the Eurasian Economic Union became a merely political tool of geopolitics. Because what's important is not why you created it, what it actually does. And what it actually does, we have already talked about this, purely economic integration. The problem is, I'm actually not even sure whether it's a problem. The fact is that after 2014, Russian leadership rediscovered new arenas where its great power status can be demonstrated and re-established. After Ukrainian conflict, Syria, Africa, Venezuela, many other arenas in the world opened up, and Russian leadership became more and more impressed with these arenas. And Eurasian Economic Union kind of turned out to be not that interesting. So if you can talk about hyperspeed rockets or something like this, it's much more interesting than to talk about non-tariff barriers in trade with Armenia and Belarus. And that's the reason why Eurasian Economic Union now receives less attention from the Russian leadership, at least from my perspective. It doesn't mean that it stopped playing an economic role. It means that Russian leadership doesn't think about it that much.
Interesting. I have a question here that I think might fit in the chat. Someone is asking, can we consider the Eurasian Economic Union or Eurasian integration as a tool of power populism in Russia?
That's a question to me again, right?
I think so, yes.
I mean,
I will come to China soon and to the Belt and Road, and then I will bring in Johannes again. But okay, please go.
It's kind of difficult to answer that because I'm not exactly sure what power populism is.
That was my question too.
I mean, so I mean, maybe the person who asked this question could also comment on what power populism is. I mean, there is an aspect of Eurasian Economic Union addressed at the Russian domestic public, which also has kind of paradoxical worldview. On the one hand, Johannes justly says that xenophobia is rather widespread in Russia, and a lot of Russians would gladly say that we need to send all these migrants away. But at the same time, the idea of Eurasian regionalism is extremely popular in Russia. And the Eurasian Development Bank for many years monitored it through a system of public opinion surveys, and they show an absolutely broad support of the ideas of Eurasian regionalism. So from this point of view, playing an integration card is also attractive for the Russian leadership in terms of showing the population that they're doing what the public wants the leadership to do. So if that is what power populism was supposed to mean, yes, I would agree. Domestic political opinion played a very important role in facilitating the regionalism in Eurasia for Russia.
Well, since the person who asked the question has not really kind of made it more precise what she or he means, we leave it here. But Johannes wants to.
Well, maybe while the person or anybody else wants to think a bit more about that question, let me bring in another aspect here, which I think is relevant. So I mentioned that Russia did not join the CAREC forum. However, over the last 2-3 years, CAREC actually decided to open up beyond the 6 original multilateral development partners that were closely involved to other development partners. So bilateral partners like GIZ and BMZ and KfW and USAID and so on are now actually regularly also engaging with CAREC and supporting CAREC. Now, it so happens that the EADB, the East Asian, Eurasian, not East Asian, Eurasian Development Bank and its sister organization, what is it called again? There's an
Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development.
Exactly.
Right?
That those two organizations, which are actually instruments, financing instruments of the EAEU, they are now participating in meetings of CAREC. Mm-hmm. They are, in fact, getting into the funding activities of projects that are broadly under the CAREC umbrella. And I believe that's actually, in the end, it's going to be the best way to ensure that there's cooperation between, on the one hand, the EAEU, and on the other hand, the grouping of the CAREC, because in the past, we've always seen that these various regional overlapping, actually often as a kind of a spaghetti bowl, as it's sometimes called, or a rice bowl or whatever, of regional organizations, that they don't cooperate. But actually, I'm very happy to say that there is now sort of at least the beginnings of cooperation between these two key financial institutions under EAEU on the one hand, and on the other hand, CAREC. And to me, that's a very promising initiative. Thank you.
Alexander, just jump in.
Really, just one sentence on this. You're absolutely right. And these two institutions, Eurasian Development Bank and Eurasian Stabilization and Development Fund, have been extremely active in developing cooperation ties with very different global and regional financial players. So Evgeny Vinokurov recently published a nice paper on this in Post-Communist Economies. It came out this year, where he summarized all these various corporations. And for these two institutions, they're really part of this global financial architecture to the full extent.
Mm-hmm. Right. But let us now turn to one actor that we have only, marginally touched upon yet in our discussion, which is China. And I would like to, to know from both of you, but maybe we start with Johannes, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, but also, China's role in CAREC, for example. I mean, how does China present itself, for example, in such a fora like CAREC? I mean, is it more about power politics and showing, hey, we are really important, and you others just follow us, or is it more one among equals, or how? I mean, this would be my first question, because I think there's not much knowledge, at least in this here in this German context about this. And then second, with relation to the Belt and Road Initiative. To what extent do you think is the Belt and Road Initiative considered as a challenge or a chance also for increasing economic integration among the former Soviet republics? How is this seen also vis-à-vis other initiatives or organizations, in this case, the Eurasian Economic Union?
Right. Well, let me maybe start with a few very high-level observations about the evolving role of China in Central Asia in particular. During the Soviet Union, there was, of course, very little cross-border links between what is now Central Asian republics and China, virtually nothing, correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra. Over the last 20 years, however, this has changed dramatically. So now China is a major trading partner for the Central Asian Republic. In fact, I believe the latest data show that it's for most of them actually the largest one. It's also a major financier of infrastructure, and I'll come back to that when talking about BRI. It has an incipient role in the security domain, but compared to Russia, it still in many ways is less familiar to Central Asians in terms of language, in terms of culture, although that too is slowly changing, because now you have quite a number of Central Asian students studying in China. But there's also the fear of the overwhelming influence and potential domination of the neighbor, and with it sort of a sense of loss of sovereignty. It's not necessarily an easy relationship, even though it's been growing in importance. It's also kind of is interesting to observe how the Central Asian countries, but Kazakhstan in particular, followed quite effectively, actually, multi-vector foreign policy, which explicitly tries to balance China, Russia, Europe, and the US, and sort of manages quite well actually to keep its own sovereign power in its country, despite these very strong outside influences, especially growing from China and still very important from Russia. Now, if you are specific about CAREC and the role of China in CAREC, that's actually interesting, because I've now observed China acting as a very important actor in CAREC over the last 20 years since its beginning. And I have to say, China's role has been remarkably, not passive, but gentle, is perhaps the best way to put it. It is not, at least not on the face of it, not assuming sort of the single all-pervasive leadership role. It is, in contrast, it's positioning itself as a broadly supportive actor in this setting, in this particular forum. And in terms of funding, it is an important funder. But again, I have to say, in terms of the way, in the context particular of the CAREC Institute, China works, it's not overwhelming the rest. And indeed, it wants to have other countries play a bigger financial role. It actually has been quite impatient in the CAREC Institute for being, besides the ADB, the only major funder. And now it's quite happy that Pakistan has come in, not with a lot of money, but it's also putting some pressure on the other countries to actually contribute. So it's not sort of your traditional, let's call it, imperial position and posture that China pursues through CAREC, but a more soft, let's put it this way, exerting soft power rather than hard power. Now, that brings me actually to BRI, and there's a bit of an interesting, how to say, incongruence here. You'd think that with China playing such a big role in CAREC, there'd be a major link between CAREC and BRI, but actually there's very little linkage. And the reason that I see is that for Chinese authorities, BRI is not a regional instrument per se. Yes, at the global, it's a projection of power, influence, and yes, even sort of global supply chains and so on, particularly to the extent they support China's access to resources and markets. But it's not designed to actually help, for example, integration, specifically designed to help integration of Central Asia or Central Asia's connectivity with the rest of the world. It's really operates purely on a bilateral basis. Basically, Chinese banks, Chinese government ministries interact with ministries and with investors in CAREC countries, rather than interacting with a regional perspective in the way they do their business. So this is an interesting difference. Now, lastly, let me say just a few words of my own assessment of the role of BRI specifically, the Belt and Road Initiative, and focusing on Central Asia, where we've actually put out a book in 2019, looking at this from the perspective of Central Asian experts themselves. So it's kind of an inside-out perspective. Now, here it's clear that, as I mentioned earlier, BRI has significant investments supporting, actually it's really China more broadly, but BRI, Belt and Road Initiative specifically over the last 6-7 years, in transport, pipelines, power, including coal, by the way, mining, telecoms, and in some industry